Hello and welcome to this video celebrating the 95th anniversary of the banker. Asia's banking sector has seen many changes over the years, from the rise of the Chinese economy to the growth of digital payments. To look at how banks have kept up with this pace of change, I'm speaking with Fred Neumann, Asia economist at HSBC. Thanks for speaking to me today, Fred.
Thanks for having me.
So how has banking in Asia changed over the past few decades, and what have been the biggest innovations seen during this time?
Well, it's changed enormously over the last few decades. It's unrecognizable, actually, if you look at banking today compared to even 2-3 decades ago. It's changed entirely. There's sort of three big changes that really stand out. The first one is the retreat of the state, if you could call it that. We had 2-3 decades ago, the state banks really dominated banking. Today, we have many more private sector banks being involved. We have smaller banks involved. If you take a market like India, for example, private sector banks now have a very important role to play. Another change is really the internationalization of banking. Now, even 3 decades ago on the capital market side, international banks were certainly present in many markets, but what has changed is the involvement of foreign banking groups in domestic retail operations as well. And this is across the board, really, and it's not just sort of banks from Europe and the US, but it's also regional banks who are really doing cross-border investments. So there's an internationalization of banking. And then the third big change is really the arrival of technology, the surge of fintech in banking that has accelerated over the past 10 years or so. And in part, it's also a reflection of customers that have become much more demanding, discerning, who are now really asking for online experiences, faster payment methods, a broader product suite to be offered. And that's driving these changes in Asia, more competition, internationalization, and really that demanding customer base. And that has led to tremendous changes over the last decades and even years.
And how has the way that banking is done evolved? What internal processes have changed, and how has customer behavior modified?
Well, one big area of change is really the professionalization of banking in Asia. If you think back 2-3 decades, many of the banks in Asia were associated with large corporations or conglomerates. They're really, in some sense, an arm's length operation of a corporate entity. And today they're standalone operations that have been highly professionalized, bringing in international best practices, also on the regulatory side. So it's a professionalization of really the banking industry, if you could call it that. The other big change is really how demanding customers have been, and they've driven innovations. And I think one of the big areas of change is that customers are demanding a far more sophisticated and broader product suite. So, for example, insurance products are being offered now, investment products are being offered, going away from sort of that state investment model, just providing deposit products. We now have a whole range of products being offered. And that's really been in response to a much more discerning customer base. As savings have increased in Asia enormously, the depositors, the savers have in tandem also then raised their expectations about what products they need for their long-term planning.
And how do you think banking will continue to evolve? And I'm thinking not just in the next few years, but really looking into future decades.
Well, technology has just begun. And, we've seen in centers like Shenzhen, for example, which is such a fintech hub, and places like Singapore as well, Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, we see really fintech taken off. And that will increasingly really mean that customers interact virtually with their banks. There are increasingly retail products available that we could only dream of 20 years ago. So the linking of insurance products with retail products, for example, just widening the product offering. The payment systems alone are just moving away from your state currency transactions towards online transactions. And that's certainly a process that is accelerating and has even accelerated over the past year during the pandemic. And so that's one of the key areas. I think the other area where you're going to see continued changes is still internationalization. And this is not just Western banks kind of making more inroads into the regional markets, but it's also really that the regional banks themselves, the local banks, are becoming increasingly international players. So we see cross-border investments happening. And I think that will just provide you with a much more internationalized banking system across the region if we think 5-10 years out from today.
Okay, it's great. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.